and the scope of work of the project. What do you understand by the scope? And what do us understand about the scope of the project? We refer to the what. When we refer to the scope of the project, we refer to the what. What must be done? The what is the scope of work. If you take the scope of work away from the project, you virtually have no project left. Because the scope determines what will be delivered, your deliverables. In other words, your scope is made up of deliverables, and the scope is made up of a work breakdown structure, which we will discuss during the lecture, and the scope will finally, the scope will be an outcome of the facility, the service, the product, or the result. So the scope of work is one of the core processes of project management. In the beginning, in the previous lectures, we said that time, cost, quality, and scope are the core processes of project management, and scope being one of them. What must be done? Let us investigate. The PMI scope management process is as follows. You do a scope initiation. After scope initiation, you do scope planning. After scope planning, you do scope definition. You define the scope. And after the definition of the scope, you do scope verification, and then you do scope change control. However, that scope initiation, where does that take place in the project life cycle? Where does planning take place in the life cycle? Where does the definition take place in the life cycle? Where does verification and scope change control take place? In essence, the scope initiation in the project management process, remember we said there are 5 project management processes, being initiation process, planning process, the execution process, the monitor and control process, and the closing process. So in essence, the initiation, scope initiation takes place during the initiation process. And the planning, scope planning takes place in the planning process. And definition takes place also in the definition planning process, and verification and scope change control. Verification happens during the execution process, and the scope change control happens during the change control process. Right. When you verify the scope, you verify that the deliverables have been delivered as per specification. So that is the PMI, Project Management Institute Scope Management Process. What is scope? Very important question. What is scope? Scope is all the work or processes involved in the creation of the products, services of the project. All the work and nothing else but the work to deliver the product, the service, the delivery, the outcome, the result or facility. Right. It also tells us what is not included in the project, which is very, very important. Today, project managers will spec the scope of work for a project, and they specify what needs to be done. They specify the scope, but what they don't specify is what is not in the scope. And this thing here, what is not included in the project, has caused many projects to fail from a lesson learned point of view. Many projects, because people don't stipulate what is not included. And if you don't do that, at the end of your project, it might end up in big conflict and big arguments upon what was agreed upon and what was not agreed upon. So it's extremely important to to specify what is in all the work, what is in scope of work, and what is out of the scope of work. Very, very important. So that is your scope of work. Project initiation, the strategic intent is obviously before you can draft the scope of work for a project, you first need to look at the need or the opportunity or even the threat. Because a lot of companies initiate projects because they are threatened. Because of the threat, a project gets born. Right. So there is the requirement, and you can see that there's a need, there's an opportunity, there's a requirement, etc. And then there's the project charter. And we discussed the project charter where we said the project charter is the mandate for the project manager to allocate resources. And we also said that the project charter authorizes the existence of a project. The project exists because of the charter, right? So, if you look at the project charter there in detail, these are the components of a project charter. There's a project title, there's a date of authorization. I just mentioned now the charter authorizes the project. There's the authorization, there's the brief scope. Have a look at this brief scope statement inside of the project charter. In the charter, the scope is not discussed in detail. It is mentioned briefly inside of the charter what needs to be done, what must be done. Then there's a summary of project processes and the roles and responsibilities, basic components of the project charter. You cannot embark on a scope management exercise if you did not have a side of project charter for the project. Very important.